Let me get my little speech here. Alrighty then. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bettina Hannigan, Executive Director of the Florence Area Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to our first Coastal Corral. We've been busy wrangling up our hardworking legislators to share with us news and information for our coastal communities. I would like to thank all of our coastal chambers of commerce that have partnered with us to bring this panel together on such short notice. Special thanks to our super busy legislators for sharing your valuable time to connect with us. For many of our businesses, closing down for a month or more has them concerned about how and if they can reopen. What resources will they have left when the day actually comes? I think I can honestly say there's a feeling of desperation for many employers and employees. Employees who live paycheck to paycheck on cash without credit cards who still haven't received a penny of unemployment. Do they give up? Maybe they sell their cars or borrow from family to hang on for a couple more weeks. These are tough times indeed. Chambers across the country are working with their businesses to bring resources, to innovate new ways to build and distribute widgets, and to build a vision of a thriving future. We must embrace change. Entrepreneurism requires bravery and stick-to-itiveness. Give us something to work with and we'll find a way. Today, my hope is that we can gain insight and understanding to help us move forward. Together, we can make lemonade out of this lemon. Together, we can rebuild our coastal communities. Thank you for joining us. I'm pleased to introduce our very own past chamber president, Lane Community College Florence Campus Dean, Dr. Russ Pearson, who will be our moderator today. Take it away, Russ.
Thank you, Bettina. And just some Zoom protocol for all of us. If we intend for everyone to be muted throughout, so please mute yourself, or we can mute you as well. And we will introduce our guests as they come on, and we'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. We do have the chat feature open. You're welcome to put in questions. We may get to them. The chambers have given us several questions to ask, so we'll see how we do in that regard. But please feel free to put any burning questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those as possible things that we can ask as our hour progresses. Is Senator Wyden on? I see Senator Merkley. I don't see Senator Wyden yet, so let me...
He's going to be joining really shortly.
No problem. We'll be here. So Senator Merkley began his term of office in 2009, and prior to that served in the Oregon House of Representatives for 5 terms, representing Central Multnomah County and East Portland. But he's not necessarily a big city boy. He was born in Myrtle Creek down in Southern Oregon, and became the Speaker of the Oregon House following the 2006 elections, and he helped create Oregon's Rainy Day Fund. And this is more of a storm, Senator Merkley, than a rainy day, but we're happy that you helped us do that. He's also competed in and finished several Ironman triathlons, and he has said his workouts help him manage the stress of his job. I'll bet you're working out quite a bit these days. We're really happy you're with us, and I know you've been integral in working on the Economic Injury Disaster Loans Program, the Emergency Economic Injury Grant. What would you like us to know as we begin this Coastal Corral today?
Well, thanks so much, Russ, for the introduction. And perhaps the most important thing is for everyone to be very familiar with and comfortable calling my various team members. And I have several of them on the call, so I wanted to point that out. Courtney Flathers is on the call, and she is my field rep who covers the coast for Lane County. Stacy Jochimson, who has the coast from Lincoln County north to the Columbia River, and Amy Amrine, who has Curry, Coos, and Douglas counties. Then a lot of these business programs involve my business liaison, Jake Okenberg, and also on the policy side back in DC, Allison Hunn. So we want many gates and doors for you to be able to contact us about the challenges that you're facing. And indeed, as I've been talking to chambers all over the state and lots of little other small business conversations, it's really a phenomenal situation. We were hit so hard by the disease itself, and then the economic implosion that stems from that. And with those goes kind of an epidemic of anxiety that has its own challenges. I don't think we're going to be able to get through this real quickly. I have been having a chart produced each day that's a 7-day rolling average of new infections. And for several weeks, we've been between 50 to 60 on that 7-day average, not dropping. We didn't accelerate from we were in the 80s upward to 100, 500, 1,000 a day. So that was great. We flattened the curve, but now the curve is flat and not headed towards zero. And we have to be able to get to the point that with every infection every day, we are able to send a team to each individual, find out who they've been in contact with, test all the people they've been in contact with, do that contact tracing. And so we need a small army of folks pursuing that. And that's something that's going to happen with the state and government being able to develop and deploy. And I know they're working towards that vision. Meanwhile, the businesses we've had open that have been essential businesses give us a laboratory for understanding what works to prevent infections in the retail setting. We're going to have to take those best lessons learned and apply them as we work to reopen the rest of the retail economy, so we don't create new infections in that process. But at least we have essentially an existing laboratory from which to learn. I have been extraordinarily frustrated by the failure to gear up personal protective equipment fast enough to meet the demand across the country, and to gear up the tests fast enough to meet the necessity of much greater testing across the country. And I was just on the phone with the commissioner of the FDA before I got on this call, talking to him about planning now to harness our entire drug manufacturing capability. So when a virus is approved, we can produce it very quickly and distribute it to hundreds of millions of Americans, because that probably the immunization is going to be the thing that really puts an end to this cycle. And if we have a production cycle that takes
thank you for that.
Year,
that's wonderful. And you mentioned PPE.
To be able to deploy it, that's a year of devastation that we shouldn't have to go through. The Paycheck Protection Program is in round 2. The first round was $350 billion. The second round was $250 billion plus another $60 billion dedicated to underserved communities. And that was an effort that I was really pushing, because I kept hearing from Oregon businesses that they couldn't get in the door. The small businesses that weren't sizable and didn't have an extensive relationship with the bank were getting shoved aside by the businesses that did. So of that $60 billion, not only is it for underserved communities, but $30 billion of it will go to small banks and small credit unions that serve those underserved communities alone. And so they won't be competing with other customers. It's still kind of a challenge, but hopefully it's going to improve. And then there's the economic injury disaster grants. The program is called disaster loans, but really $10,000 grants to very small business as an option to the PPP program. And that program ran out of money, so we refunded it with an additional $60 billion. But also the administration was limiting it to $1,000 per employee, which meant it really wasn't of much help at all. And so we've asked for the administration, that wasn't in the law, that was an administrative decision. We've asked the administration to lift that rule, and if it needs more funding in order to lift that rule, then we need to give it more funding. That brings me then to efforts on fishing. So there was $300 million for assisting the fishing industry, including tribal fishing across the country. That's not very much when you think about the whole country. The rest of this, we're talking billions, hundreds of billions, dozens of billions, 300 million. So I have sent I've been consulting with the fishing industry and the coastal communities, and have prepared a proposal that would dedicate $2 billion specifically to federal purchases of catches that normally go to restaurants. And now the demand has just dropped because people eat certain kinds of foods at restaurants different from what they buy in the grocery store and go home. And so when I was talking to the head of Pacific Seafood 2 days ago, he was telling me that in some lines, in some seafood lines, the drop has been 98% in demand. Others, it's been 30% drop in demand. but that including the grocery stores and the restaurant demand, it's over 50% drop, so drop in half. Of course, that translates to the prices for that our fishermen are paid and the ability to sustain the entire coastal fishing economy. So in addition to those purchases, another 1.5 billion is in the proposal to go to NOAA for specific relief to damaged fishing industries across the country. So I'll just stop there. If Ron's on the call, he'll want to jump in and make some initial comments, and then both of us will try to answer whatever questions or take your questions we don't know the answers to and get back to you.
Very good. Thank you, Senator Merkley. And Senator Wyden, are you on the call?
I am here. Am I coming through?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Wonderful. And Russ, thank you for scheduling this. And I agree with everything that Senator Merkley has said. And what I thought I would do is touch on 3 or 4 areas that will supplement what he's talking about. One other aspect, because Jeff mentioned economic injury disaster loans and the emergency economic injury grants, we were able to get the program expanded to include private nonprofits. So guess what? That means local chambers of commerce are eligible. And that was something that we worked on together. Okay. From my state office, Molly, Malcolm, and June are on. Jenny, Rachel, and Bobby basically handle the finance committee issues. And I'm sure everybody knows Senator Merkley is on the Appropriations Committee, a hugely important committee. I'm the ranking Democrat on the Finance Committee, so our 2 committees kind of bookend each other for purposes of these important issues. I'm going to mention 4 issues going forward that I think are central for the Oregon coast and just tick them off. And as I say, Jeff and I work together on these issues. I've come to the conclusion as a result of all these Zoom calls and virtual town meetings. I had the state's first virtual statewide town hall meeting. Thousands of people were paying attention, and my judgment, Russ, is particularly relevant to the coast. And that is, I think all of these business packages have, to a great extent, with respect to business, missed the smallest of the small. And that happens to be almost all the businesses on the Oregon coast. They're almost all small. So in coronavirus 4 that we're working on, I've made it clear that my top priority on the tax side, as it relates to going forward as a ranking Democrat in the Finance Committee, will be to provide a modest amount of cash, direct cash, to these very small businesses. Businesses with, for example, under $1 million gross. Now that's a lot of money for a business on the Oregon coast. And the reason I'm going to propose it is, as I talk to these small businesses, they tell me, Ron, you know, these loan programs and PPP, that sounds okay. I don't know if I'll do it, but maybe I will. But what I really need is a modest amount of money to deal with my inventory. Several breweries told me that they had to replace their beer because it was going to spoil. And so I was on the phone with people from the Wall Street Journal and the like, and 1188 Brewing in John Day is talking about the fact that their beer went bad. And they feel that if they got, well, certainly $40,000 or $50,000, which could be tied directly to their previous tax filing, so you don't have to go through all the banks and the rest, they said that'd be a lifesaver. So I've made it clear that for the next round of business activity, I'm going to really focus on the Finance Committee on what I call the smallest of the small, because I think they've been forgotten in this thing. And that happens to be most of the businesses on the Oregon coast. That's number 1. Number 2, infrastructure. and Jeff and I will both be very involved in this. Finance Committee's got to get the money to pay for it. The Appropriations Committee usually gets to figure out how it's going to be spent. That was what Mark Hatfield used to laugh about. But there's an increasing amount of talk about infrastructure, roads, bridges, transportation systems, but we in the Oregon delegation believe in infrastructure writ large. So it would apply, for example, to rural broadband. And everybody knows that there are decent chunks of rural Oregon where you're not getting a connection. So that's number two, and a lot of you have expressed interest in trying to make sure that the model that was used the last time that I spent time on, Build America Bonds, that we've really got it tailored to small communities. So we're going to want your input on that. That's number two.
Great.
Number three is rural healthcare. And our rural hospitals and our rural providers are really hurting now because they've been good guys. What they said is, you know, we are people who practice the Oregon way, always trying to do the right thing regardless of politics. And they basically said, we're going to put our focus on COVID-19 patients. We're not going to do the elective surgeries, which get paid at the commercial rates. And now a lot of them are really hurting. They're telling me, Ron, I can't keep my doors open. I don't know what I'm going to do. And the Trump people have not made life easier. And I'll describe why and what we're trying to do. In one of the earlier coronavirus packages, I was able to get something called advance payments. So these rural hospitals could get money to cover what they had lost on elective surgeries. Whoopee, people liked it. Well, the Trump people came around and slapped a big old interest fee on it. And so we're trying to roll that back. And then they've also compounded things by freezing the part that it was expanded to, what's called Part B of Medicare, the outpatient part. And they're reviewing the whole hospital arrangement. So I'm really worried that rural hospitals and rural providers are about to take yet another big wallop. So I'm spending a lot of time on that. Finance Committee's got jurisdiction over the Medicare and Medicaid payments. Finally, the issue of fire. It looks like we're going to have another tough fire season. So today, 100% of Oregon's United States senators, joining with senators from around the West, are trying to get the Forest Service through Vicki Christensen, who is somebody who's worked in Oregon, a capable, good person, to let us know what we're going to do, because the projection looks like we're going to have another tough fire season. And here, one of my concerns, and my colleagues, we joined on this letter, there must be 8 or 10 of us. I'm concerned that the Forest Service thinks that they're going to take care of this all from the skies, essentially with spraying and the like. Well, I think you can take care of a lot of that, but I'm still puzzled about what's going to happen on the ground, how those people are going to practice social distancing. What does it mean for these wonderful people that are part of our history called the hotshots, where you get these really superstars of fighting fire? And so we're really working on that. And I think the only other one I want to mention is I've been working to develop what I call a strategic food reserve, an Oregon strategic food reserve. And I want to make sure we've got a lot of frozen fish from the Oregon coast in it. So we'll be talking to you about that too. Okay. Now, one of the benefits of seniority that Senator Merkley always waits for in this part of the program is that I get the easy questions and he gets the difficult ones. But we just really appreciate the chance to work with you all. It's been a team approach. from the Oregon delegation, and on our watch, it always will be.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. And you may be the senior senator from our state, but you still look like a young man. So,
Oi, we're listening to my wife.
I have one more. I know you both have to. You've got a busy day, and you've got to get going. I think you're both in Washington, so you've already been up for a long time. But I have one question, and you both can take a stab at it, or one of you can answer it. Here closer to home, along the coast, many of our businesses are also concerned about protecting their employees and customers as we talk about reopening slowly but surely. And a particular concern, and you mentioned it, Senator Wyden, PPE. Particular concern is the cost of providing PPE to their employees, implementing much more labor-intensive cleaning protocols, installing plexiglass barriers at their customer counters. They're probably only going to be able to have a fraction of their usual customer base in their business. Can you offer any hope or help for us, or counsel for Oregon businesses here on the coast?
Let's just start, and then I'll follow it up. We both have been on it.
So let's start with the personal protective equipment. This really is something we should cover nationally for businesses, that extra cost, separate from the PPE or separate from the economic injury disaster grants or disaster loans. And so that's an issue as we look to this next Corona 4 bill, nationwide coverage of those costs, particularly for very small businesses. And because it disproportional, the small retail business, disproportional cost of the expense. It is true that if one goes onto the PPP program, where the federal government picks up the payroll for 2 months, plus 25% on top, that on top portion is eligible for any other normal business expenses or Corona business expenses. So just for those who are applying for PPP, that money can be used in that fashion. And if one needs a letter to kind of back that up and provide comfort, we could do that piece of it. I think it's really important that we take the examples from the businesses that have been open, the Targets, the essential grocery stores and so forth, and look, this is where I was talking about the contact tracing. If we're seeing that there are no infections occurring in those settings where they're doing one-way aisles, 6-foot separation, customers come in with masks, the clerks have masks, then let's lay out those protocols in a fashion. This would actually happen at the state level, not the federal level, under Trump's kind of delegation to the states. But let's take those best practices and apply them so those stores can reopen, because the lack of revenue coming in the door is just crushing businesses. They can use a PPP to pay rent or mortgage, which is one of the factors I keep hearing from small businesses. If our employees have stayed with the team, but if we don't have money to, after 2 months, to pay rent or mortgage, we're up the creek. And once you dismantle your team, it's going to be a very, very slow recovery. And of course, a lot of teams have already been dismantled. To imagine, who could imagine 30 million Americans filing for unemployment in a 6-week period? And the coastal economy, I just had to draw attention to this earlier, but you all are the hardest hit because of the dependence on small retail, tourist, and decreased port activity. Because you're the hardest hit, Ron and I are just kind of on special alert to do everything we can to help.
Senators, this is Betsy.
There's no Betsy out there.
Betsy.
There is Betsy out there.
There's Betsy.
Before you guys leave, I want to change from PPP to PPE. And to ask, apropos the last comment about how hard hit the coast has been, ask for your help. Early on in this epidemic, the state was in control. The state of Oregon was in control of issuing the PPE. They now are shifting away and saying to the little hospitals, we're giving you a protocol to reopen, but you're on your own for PPE. which puts them out into the cutthroat, in many cases fraudulent supply chain to try to find their own PPE. The governor has set up a condition antecedent to say you have to have X amount of PPE in stock before you can begin your procedures. And yet yesterday when I made the plea to change their protocol, they're distributing PPE in a formulaic way. When I made the plea to make sure that all of the little hospitals have theirs so that they can reopen, can rehire people, Columbia Memorial fired 70 or laid off 70 people and ameliorate the suffering of Oregonians who have had to forego elective procedures. Will you guys please advocate to the governor that they make sure that all of the little independent hospitals get all the PPE that they need to meet the conditions set out to be able to reopen? If we let little hospitals go broke on our watch during a global pandemic, we collectively are going to look like idiots. So would you please use the power of your offices to advocate with Kate and her staff to fully stock those little hospitals with PPE and get them open?
Betsy, let me pick up on what I said. Did you hear my comments initially about rural hospitals?
I did, sir.
Okay. There's no issue I have spent more time on in the last 5 weeks when I have been sitting at this desk every day, except for zooming into a couple of Passover Seders, than rural hospitals. These people have been clobbered as a result of the advance payment issue and now the extra expenses with respect to PPE. So the answer to your question is yes, yes, and more yes. And obviously, what this involves is getting enough revenue, first and foremost, to these rural hospitals so they don't have to choose between one essential service or another because they're trying to keep their doors open. So there are other things I'm looking at to try to help them get their fair share, for example, of the provider revenues. So we will, both of us will work cooperatively with the governor with respect to the PPE rules in the state, which we're not in charge of, and she is, but I want you to hear my pledge loud and clear that there is no issue I have spent more time on in the last 5 weeks than trying to shore up the revenue base of small rural hospitals, and I will continue to do that, okay?
Thank you very much.
Betsy,
Jeff,
can
I just finish the question on PPE, and then I want to let you come back to it. There are more pieces to the PPE puzzle, and Jeff touched on the role for the various governments. We do badly need a national blueprint so that people will see the feds are going to do this and the states are going to do that. Jeff was spot on in mentioning this question of best practices. For example, what I hear with respect to PPE and the local level is, for example, if the federal government would just provide some sensible guidance to companies, we could have companies in Oregon producing a lot more PPE, and a lot of those businesses yourself, Betsy. So we're going to both be part of this effort to try to get Oregon, and particularly small businesses and hospitals, on the coast, what they need. And let me give the last word to Jeff.
Well, the issue in part has been the distribution of funds to buy PPE, and the first $100 billion that was dedicated to go to shore up the healthcare system was the first $30 billion went on a formula with Medicare A and B, and it didn't really get a proportional share to our small rural hospitals. And so we've been pushing for the balance of that funding and the next set of funding to go and really, really be focused on rural clinics and rural hospitals. The piece that I'm a little uncertain about, Betsy, and I'll have to check on this, in the initial phases, Ron and I were just on a personal line daily with the national stockpile. And then the national stockpile essentially ran out. During that period, we were trying to get the executive branch to gear up a national PPE plan and production so that there would not be a shortage when the stockpile ran out. That did not happen on a national basis. And now, as you mentioned, kind of the cutthroat just everyone in it for themselves, trying to do it on the common market. So the state's no longer getting significant supplies from the national stockpile. There may be a few coming in, but that's not the big focus now. And so I think the state's between a rock and a hard place on this, but I've got to check back in with the governor. But I will really reemphasize this need. In the retail setting, it's a different standard for basically wearing a mask of some sort for the clerks and the customers. In the healthcare setting, they really need these N95 masks and surgical masks, and that's a much tougher problem that we're facing. So thank you for raising it, and we're working the problem.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thank you, Senator Merkley and Senator Wyden. We appreciate the time you've given us today. It's been wonderful. I know that, we here on the coast, there are Democrats, there are Republicans, there are independents, but especially at a time like this, we are first and foremost all Oregonians. We appreciate the good work in this season. Let's give them a Zoom hand. It looks like this. Thank you so much. And I understand your staff is going to stick around and take up any other issues that might come up over the course of our time together.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, they are. Take care.
So that audio Zoom bomber was Senator Betsy Johnson. We kept trying to mute this person. We couldn't tell who it was, and she kept unmuting herself. And I'm so glad you did, Senator Johnson. We're delighted that you're on board. She is from Scappoose, District 16, up along the North Coast. Her constituents certainly know her well. Some of the rest of us down in the Central and Southern Coast may not be as familiar with her. She is, among other things, a licensed commercial pilot. She founded what is now known as Transwestern Aviation back in 1978. She began the House of Representatives, serving District 31 at first in 2001. And she is amazing. I've heard nothing but fantastic things about her. Betsy, I've got a question for you to kind of follow up on the conversation with the senators. I heard lots of conversation amongst the chambers of commerce up and down the coast about the climate action tax. And I certainly understand how important education funding is, and I know you do too. But there are many parents of school-age children who suddenly face an uncertain job market, which of course creates an even bigger problem. The majority of our smaller businesses don't have the reserves required to cover business expenses during the season of little to no income, and now they're considering trying to reopen with all the upfront staff and inventory costs. And we've heard from many of our chamber members that having to pay the cat on top of the new cash flow reality will make it very difficult for some of them to survive. So what's the latest news you can share?
Well, several things. Let me start out by saying, sorry, I just didn't want those two guys to get away without asking them the question of PPE. Your little Gold Beach Hospital hangs in the balance. I mean, when I say yours, the Southern Oregon. And I think that the little hospitals, the ones that are not affiliated with chains or big systems, are being treated very, very unfairly. I believe my colleagues would join me in arguing for a full complement of PPE to go to those little hospitals so that they can get reopened and they can start their cash flow. And I just didn't want those guys to get away without saying that. The second thing I'm going to say is that it is not the climate action tax, it is a corporate activities tax. And I am going to defer to Arnie Roblin. I know he's on the call. I will chime in with my own opinion, but it was Arnie that did the heavy lifting on the student success and can set the conditions that gave rise to this tax and the expectations of what it was supposed to do. And then I'll be happy to share my editorial comment afterwards, but I am respectful of the fact that Arnie and his colleagues traveled all around the state to make the case for why an investment in our K-12 system was important. And then we can talk about what's the future of the CAT, because it is going to be extraordinarily problematic on all kinds of levels. But if you don't mind, I'm going to give home court advantage to your South Coast senator, and I will chip in afterwards. But it is the corporate activity tax, not the climate action.
Very good, and we do know that it's often been characterized in both ways in some of the press too. Senator Arnie Roblin, you are a South Coast institution as well. You've served 2 terms in the Senate. You served 5 terms in the House, and interestingly enough, you were co-speaker of the House in 2011, 2012, when there were the same number of Democrats and Republicans, and that was largely considered a very successful term. You're a former math teacher, principal of Marshfield High School down the Bay Area, and you're retiring. We're certainly thankful for your service. So please fill us in a little more on the corporate activities tax.
Sure, thank you very much, and I appreciate this conversation. And I would tell people in chambers, if you're not engaged in your counties, they're really important in this whole process, and many of them are having separate meetings. I know that Senator Johnson, Representative Gomberg, Representative Mitchell, myself are on a lot of those meetings 2 or 3 times a week. So I would say keep involved, because when it comes to hotels and all those other kinds of stuff, it is the counties that are making a lot of those decisions, and they need to have your input. Chambers are really important at all of these conversations and at the state level. The first thing I would say is we aren't in session. I think you know that. We also didn't finish our last session well. So we haven't had the opportunity to, one, put more money into the emergency fund, and we've mostly spent that now. And so when it comes to the cat tax, there are lots of conversations going on. I know that all of the legislators have been pushing, and we can't do anything about it unless we are in session. So there is no opportunity for us to make changes. We have been having conversations with the governor's office from the very beginning, saying that they should make sure, we were hoping that they would put it off like they did the income tax and some other kinds of things. That has not happened. We have encouraged them to have a conversation about suspending any fines for anybody that doesn't do well on their estimates and all those other kinds of stuff. We know that a lot of that is taking place individually, but I wish there was a more generalized statement from the governor's office and the revenue department. I think they have the authority to do those things, and we have, I think, as a group, been explaining to them that we think those things should be done. 2 things. One, it doesn't take place until you've sold your first $1 million worth. The activity taxes, anything you sell adds up to that first $1 million. So no one pays any tax until they've made $1 million or sold $1 million worth of material. So there have been conversations about whether that should be changed up or down. We had I was one of the co-chairs of the committee on the coronavirus joint committee that we did right after the session got over to try to bring together ideas about what we needed to move forward on immediately. We thought we were going to have a special session early. It did not happen. This was one of the big conversations in that one. And we recognize that there are a lot of places the cash flow is a really important aspect, and we were hopeful that revenue would defer some of that, allow them to pay it later. The other thing that came up in that conversation is Amazon's doing really well. Target's doing really well. There's a lot of these companies who have this tax, and it's 0.57% of those sales, that are doing really well. And we would really like them to pay their tax because we need the revenue in the state to keep these other things going. So that conversation took place as well. So we continue to have, I think, conversations in every one of our caucuses, Democrat, Republican, House, and Senate, about what we can do moving forward. I don't think there has been any kind of decision with regard to what happens when we have our emergency session, if we have one. The governor is in charge of calling that if we're going to come into a special session. There are 2 ways she can do that. One is through a special Article 10 bringing us in, which means that we could do it electronically as well. She has not anticipated doing that. We're looking at a regular special session where we'll have to have quorums show up in the Capitol to do our business and figure out social distancing and all those kinds of things. So the cat is definitely on all of our minds. I think from our perspective of those of us in the legislature talking about it, that companies should not be too worried about this first payment that was due, because I would expect that most of us are inclined to figure out how to help with that. But changes, there are conversations going on with lots of people. The Student Success Committee went all over the state, as Betsy said, got a lot of input from a lot of different people. Our revenue chairs who were on that are the ones that came up with this particular tax, which is a lot more resilient than the taxes we have already regarding education. So we'll give you more as we get closer, but right now we are not in session, so we don't really have any authority. And that's why I'm insisting that you really keep engaged in your counties, all the conversations they're having. I know most of us are involved in those conversations, trying to get input so that we know what's best when we get ready. Talk to your legislators about those things that are important, and I appreciate the question and the conversations that are going on. And thank you, Benita, for getting this all organized. Bettina.
She does good work. Thank you, Senator Roblin. Senator Johnson, did you want to follow up on that at all?
Yes, again, I don't mind batting last because I've got a lot of comments about this. So if Representative Gomberg wants to comment and Representative Mitchell, I'll bat last.
Okay. Representative Gomberg, you're certainly welcome to take that up. I do have another thing that our chambers are interested in knowing about too. So let me maybe start with that, and you can roll the other tax into your answer as well. You sit on the Joint Interim Committee on Ways and Means and the Emergency Board, and we as chambers, municipalities, and coastal businesses, including your district, which is District 10, includes Lincoln, Tillamook, Yamhill, and Polk, so about 100 miles of the coast and 50 miles inland through the coastal range. So we're concerned about the sunsetting of the state lodging tax. With estimated revenues already down by 70+% in that regard, now more than ever, we need to maintain that current funding level. So how are you thinking about helping the small businesses that rely on that tax?
Well, thank you for that good question. And I'll remind you, I first came to the coast to be the executive director of our Lincoln City Chamber of Commerce some 34, 35 years ago. And I do sit on the Emergency Board and Ways and Means, as does Senator Roblin and Senator Johnson. So the coast is well represented in those important environments. You asked about the lodging tax. Well, that was all geared up and ready to be renewed when the last legislative session collapsed. And I hope that it's going to be very high on the list when we return. I'll remind you that the issue we were talking about was the state portion of the lodging tax, not the local portion. And that's an important distinction. And even if we don't get the sunset renewed, that we'll still keep collecting state lodging taxes. It's just a question of how much we will be collecting. But I want to jump back to something that I think is a lot more pressing and a lot more current for us. And let's just cut to the chase. Here on the coast, we have the highest unemployment in the entire state right now. That's not surprising with our reliance on tourism and on agriculture and on fishing, but we are struggling more than other parts of the state. And our chambers are telling us that they're worried that as many as 1/3 of our small businesses are not going to recover from this economic downturn. That's dire news. On the employment front, well, the good news is the employment division's gone from 100 claim takers a month ago to about 500 now. And they're working on the backlog, but that backlog continues to exist, which means people who we referred to earlier living paycheck to paycheck are going 3, 4, 5 weeks without a paycheck. That's critical, and all of we legislators are working around the clock helping individuals navigate the red tape and try to make sure they get the benefits that they are entitled to and they are waiting to. I'll add that for people who weren't previously qualified for those benefits, the self-employed, the gig workers, the contractors, that the federal government changed the rules. The state has now updated their programming so they can accept those applications, and people can now apply if they are qualified. If you previously applied, you need to update your claim. If you haven't applied yet, do apply, and your request will be backdated. So that's going on. Senator Wyden touched on our need for money for our smallest businesses, and he's right on point. When we voted on the CAT tax, the corporate activity tax, I stood up on the floor and said, you know, $1 million ain't what it used to be, and advocated that we should actually raise that floor from 1 million to 2 million, which would have cost about $160 million out of the 1 billion plus that we plan to generate. I still think that that too many small businesses are caught up in this new tax. and that we can make some adjustments there. I'll also remind you that this last week, the State Department of Revenue announced that they were going to increase the requirement for quarterly payments from 5,000 to 10,000, so that if your quarterlies are going to be 10,000 or less, you don't need to make those quarterlies. That's going to help some of our small businesses, but not help them enough. One other thing while I've got the microphone, and I certainly want to make sure Representative Mitchell gets in on this conversation, is that that our senators worked hard to get us more of that PPP money, the payroll protection money. But we coastal legislators have been adamant in our concern that the money is being handled primarily by financial institutions in Portland and along the I-5 corridor. Now, these are good people and their job is to help the entire state, but it would be naive to suggest that proximity doesn't matter and that it's easier to work with a bank down the street that you know and deal with every day than it is one that's 100 miles away. And we need to make sure that those dollars get to our businesses, just as we need to make sure that the unemployment benefits get to our unemployed workers. The state seems to be focused on seeing that they help the most people. I'm concerned that we help the people that are hurting the most, and that's along our coastal communities and our coastal economy.
Thank you, Representative Gomberg. We appreciate your service. And you mentioned Representative Mitchell, Tiffiny Mitchell from Astoria, who represents House District 32. And that includes Clatsop and Tillamook counties and just a little bit of Washington County. And I understand, Representative Mitchell, that that you're moving to Washington State after this term. So you'll be missed here in Oregon, but we're happy for your service even through the rest of this term. And you're on the House Interim Committee on Economic Development and on Human Services. And I wonder if you can share just a little bit about the $8 million that were recently set aside to assist landlords in Oregon. And we're interested to know if that's earmarked solely for residential landlords, or will owners of commercial properties also be eligible? What can you tell us about how that'll be distributed?
So you'll have to forgive me with the economic development appointment that actually recently happened. That is not on the committee that I served on consistently throughout my tenure. Now that said, to answer your question, and we might have to pull in Senator Roblin or Representative Gomberg on this question as well, because they actually served on the emergency board that made that allocation. But my understanding is that it is purely for residential. And it's going to actually go through the community action teams that will end up then doling the money out. It goes just as they do right now. It will go directly to the landlord after that application has been made for someone to get their rent covered. So it will not flow through the tenant themselves. It goes to the landlord. So, and yes, it is only for residential at this time. I heard something earlier today that the governor was also interested in trying to get some program together for commercial. So, but yeah, that's about it.
Very good. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. And Senator Roblin and Representative Gomberg, I got that right? Yeah, maybe? It looks like I did. Okay, perfect. Oh, sorry. Can I just add one additional thing about the corporate activities tax as well? So I think it's really important to bring up here, and you kind of alluded to it, that we all believe that it's really important to make sure that our kids get educated. And every single, I haven't seen some of my colleagues further south on the little like picture of all the pictures of everybody who are on the line. So I'm not sure Representative Brock Smith or those folks are on here or not, but the colleagues that I am aware of on this call, myself and Senator Roblin and Representative Gomberg and Representative Johnson, all supported the cat tax when we voted that into law, because we all understand how important that is. And I think it's important to also mention that the way that it's structured really is to try to make sure that we are protecting the smallest of the small in terms of revenue. So a lot of our smaller mom and pop businesses, restaurants, all of those folks are very unlikely to see themselves get caught up in the tax because it is only intended to impact some of the larger businesses. Now, granted, we have a lot of, like hotels and stuff out on the coast that will be in that net of people who would be subject to the cap. but the Department of Revenue is working on additional guidelines right now. Representative Gomberg talked a little bit about some of those, to where they're trying to make sure that they at least attempt to help some of those folks who are going to owe something, and changing some of those thresholds. We're still trying to do more, but I hope that people realize that we really are trying to be sensitive to the fact that it is going to be impactful for some folks, but also knowing that, you know, we've heard projections that there could be, you know, a $2 to $3 billion shortfall over the next biennium. And we want to really make sure that the people who don't suffer as a result of all of this are going to be our kids who really depend on the education that the state of Oregon is able to provide for them. So.
Thank you, Representative Mitchell. We appreciate it. Let's see, we've got 6 or 7 minutes left, and I'm happy, Senator Johnson, to give you 3 or 4 of them. You said you had a little more to say. Would you,
I do.
would you like to tell us what you'd like to tell us?
I do. I want to come back and talk about the state lodging tax, and I would beg correction from my colleagues, but I think it's time that we have a conversation about the application of this tax. There has been long pressure to try to free up some of the sideboards to make it available for law enforcement for those communities, coastal communities especially, that are inundated in the summer with visitors, seaside, some of your coastal communities. I think we have to have a conversation about it. Travel Oregon right now, that is a semi-autonomous agency, is sitting on $70 million. They are off budget for the legislature, so we don't have much control over how they spend their money. The Oregon Restaurant Lodging Association has been particularly territorial about the state lodging tax, and I think it would profit from a much wider conversation about how it's being used, how it. There was a school of thought prior to COVID that said what we don't need is to spend a whole lot of whole lot more money to bring people to the coast, because parts of the coast are drowning in visitors and don't have adequate accommodation, including hotels, infrastructure, police force, to make sure that those visitors have a positive visitor experience. So I would very much advocate, before we just rush out and vote for this tax, to have a conversation about how it is appropriately spent. The governor has her eye on a big chunk of it to go for a series of athletic events in Eugene. They were scheduled for, I think, 21, and they may have to be moved now. But this needs a broader conversation, as the landscape has tremendously changed in hospitality, leisure, and recreation. The next thing I'd say about the CAT is going to be the gift that keeps on giving. When the revenues from the CAT were calculated, it was calculated in 2019, when Oregon's economy was incredibly robust. The promise was $2 billion a biennium, $1 billion a year. With the collapse now of our economy, I don't know how realistic those numbers are. I am very much in the camp to defer this, or to take a serious look at what parts of the Student Success Act could be deferred or scaled back, because I don't think there are going to be adequate CAT revenues. And Arnie, if I'm full of it, argue with me when I stop talking. We are going to have the dilemma of, if the CAT revenues are not as anticipated or projected in 2019, the education advocates are going to push very, very, very hard to be made whole. And the argument is going to be, just as Representative Mitchell made, it's the kids. But in a zero-sum game, because we have to have a balanced budget, I don't know who those of us on Ways and Means take the money away from. Our budget the shape of the universe will be known on May the 20th. May the 20th is a pivotal date. The revenue forecast comes out then, and it is predicted to be down between $2 and $3 billion for this biennium, and between $1 and $5 billion for the next biennium. How that's going to get made up remains to be seen. In the past, we have implemented a series of cuts and additional revenue. There's nobody left to tax. And so I don't know exactly how we're going to work out of this. The governor has asked her agency people to begin preparing potential cuts. There will be pain across the board. The governor reserves to herself the ability to do allotment cuts, which are a pretty blunt instrument that cuts everybody a like percentage. As Arnie said, it is only the legislature that can go in and ameliorate that. But any deferring of the CAT revenues from the intended purpose, which was the Student Success Act, are going to cause a considerable amount of angst among people who supported it with the expectation it was going to go to education. The general fund backfill is going to be very problematic, and the mixed guidance and changing of rules from the Department of Revenue and the governor has made a volatile political situation even more so, because people don't know exactly what the rules are. The rules for the CAT had not yet been written by the Department of Revenue, and we're already monkeying around with them. And last but not least, I would comment on your characterization, Mr. President, of the climate action tax. And I just want to share with you how misguided I think the state of Oregon is in some of its thinking. Right now, as we're all on this call thinking about the economic collapse of our beloved state, I want you to know that one of the state agencies is spending money and staff on promulgating rules for pressure at shower heads. We have got to get our own head on straight and realize that when this pandemic passes, we've got to get our agencies focused on core missions. We've got to make sure that they have the adequate tools for the next century, a UI system that isn't based on COBOL. It was a platform used in the 70s. We have got to figure out what is the business of government in Oregon. We cannot be all things to all people. There is going to be economizing. And if I were Queen, we would stop any new programs in their tracks, with the possible exception of parts of the Student Success Act, if we can figure out how the economies of that work. But we are going to be in serious economic trouble, and it is going to take all of us to try to figure out how to get out of this, because we have much more need and want than we have revenue to support it.
That's it for Queen.
And I'm going to pile in here for just a minute and make it very clear. We're going to have less revenue because less people are working and they're making less money, so they're going to be paying less income tax. But we are also going to have less money coming in from our lodging taxes, as you well know, because people aren't traveling right now. We are going to have less money coming in from gasoline taxes because people aren't driving as much, even though the cost of gasoline is down. And we're going to have less money coming into the Oregon lottery because people aren't playing those lottery games, which, by the way, our restaurants are still being asked to pay taxes on the machines in businesses that are closed and on machines that aren't turned on. The only place that we're making any money right now is with the sale of cannabis or alcohol. But don't think for a minute that that's going to do anything to make up the gap. And meanwhile, oh, by the way, we've got the conclusion of a timber lawsuit pending out there for $1 billion that the state may be on the hook for. And while that's being appealed, the interest on that racks up at $250,000 a day. So don't think when this is all over with that we're just going to pile dollars in to fix the problems. We're going to be looking at where we cut budgets and how we can keep the state solvent in an environment where we have to balance the budget because we're not allowed to operate at a deficit.
Thank you, Representative.
I just want to say,
I appreciate all of our panelists today for their forthrightness, their frankness. Let's give them a Zoom hand, all of us. We appreciate it very much. Thank you, Senator Roblin, Senator Johnson, Representative Gomberg, Representative Mitchell. And this concludes. We're out of time. I know that the various staffs have been monitoring the chats. So if you didn't get your question answered, and frankly, none of you did because we had a few questions and didn't even get through all of those, but I know the staffs are taking notes and will continue working on behalf of all of us as Oregonians. This season that we're in, it strikes me that it highlights something that most of us on the coast understand anyway, that we really do need each other. We really do need to work together, that our businesses are much stronger when they unite and work together. That's what the Chambers of Commerce are all about. I'm thankful to our representatives here along the coast and the folks that have joined us today. They were the first responders. We just didn't have enough time to get the entire Coastal Caucus on. Many others would have loved to have been here too. And I appreciate the Oregon Coastal Caucus. It includes both Republicans and Democrats who really do consider the needs and desires and wishes of coastal residents. So thank you to all of you, and thank you for joining us today for this first ever Coastal Corral, brought to you by the Chambers of Commerce all along the coast. And special thank you to Bettina Hannigan and the Florence Area Chamber of Commerce for creating this wonderful idea. All the best to all of you. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Bettina.
Thanks.
Thanks, Russ.
Thanks, Dan. Farewell to all.